Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. Today I'm doing something a little bit different and I'm doing an audiobook roundup for you guys. At the start of this year I restarted my Audible. My idea was to get a few more books under my belt so I had more to review in my weekly videos. However, I've actually had enough to review even with like my normal reading pace. So I thought instead I'd just sit down twice a year and do a bit of a 6-month roundup of the audiobooks I've been listening to. I also think that for some of the books on this list it was a little bit hard for me to pay attention. I've mostly been listening to them while I've been driving, and like my attention span isn't good, especially like going to and from work and you're kind of reflecting on the work day and being like, you know, replaying the conversations or kind of processing what's happened so that you can make sense of it all. And because my brain is going so fast, I'm focused on driving and I'm focused on thinking, I'm not always focused on the book, and it means I miss things, and it means that, you know, they're a little bit harder to follow than if I was just sitting reading it and had my full attention on it. So I didn't feel like it was fair to do a full review because I don't think some of these books have been given like a full chance by me. And you know, sometimes like the narration can also let a book down, I think. I think audiobooks can be a real hit and miss because of the performance, and it's not always like a criticism of the performance but more like my personal taste, and then that really changes like your whole experience of that book. Other times I think the performance can actually enhance the book, and there's some books I would prefer to like consume in audiobook format than like physically reading it. The Hobbit is an example. There's quite a lot of different Hobbit audiobooks, but there's this one in particular. It's got the golden smaug on the front, and the narrator, I can't remember his name, but he's got a very deep voice, and I listened to that audiobook a lot as a child, and it's just comforting, and it's the perfect style of book to listen to as an audiobook as well. I also think the Harry Potter audiobooks with Stephen Fry's narration, you know, not an unpopular opinion at all, his audiobook narration for Harry Potter is just amazing. Everyone loves it. There's so many people that just listen to them over and over again to fall asleep, and I can see why. I actually listened to them all again about 2 years ago, and yeah, Stephen Fry is just the GOAT audiobook narrator. Something else to note about my audiobook choices, I tend to choose audiobooks where I think I'm not going to read the physical book but I'm still intrigued to like consume the story. If it's like a really long series or a really long book, I'm more likely to pick it up as an audiobook. Game of Thrones was an example of this. I listened to all of the Game of Thrones books back in like 2012 or something, 2013, quite a long time ago. But at that time, especially with my reading speed at the time, I don't think I would have actually managed to read Game of Thrones like physically. And so it was the next best thing to do was to listen to the audiobooks, and they had a very good narrator also. Another reason why I might choose audiobooks, and let's use Everything is Tuberculosis as an example. I actually did do a full review of that audiobook on my channel, so I'm not going to talk about that one too much today. But even though I love reading John Green's books and I would have read it, I actually do prefer to hear John Green reading it to me. I felt the same about Anthropocene Reviewed. That one was like very personal and had a lot of his own personal stories, and I'm so used to like listening to John Green's videos on YouTube. So in that example, even though I would have liked the signed copy and to have had the physical book, I enjoy it more with John Green reading it, and you know, I will re-listen to that book. Already re-listened to Anthropocene Reviewed last year, and I also just really love his narration style in general. So there you go, there's just a little bit of an insight into like my audiobook kind of behaviour and why I choose the books that I do. Without further ado, let's get into the other books I listened to this year. We'll just bypass Everything is Tuberculosis, go and watch that video if you haven't seen it already. But that one was very good. That was like maybe my favourite or second favourite audiobook of this list, so gives a 5-star from me. The first audiobook I listened to this year, that did take me like a good two and a half months to get through. I actually took a break from it to listen to Everything is Tuberculosis, and I think I took a break from it to listen to Frankie as well, which is another one on this list, because Everything is Tuberculosis was like 5 hours, just under 6 hours. Frankie was also not very long, and Mistborn book 1 was like 24 hours or something like that. I decided to listen to The Final Empire, which was Mistborn book 1, at the beginning of the year because I was a little bit intrigued about Brandon Sanderson. I hadn't read any Brandon Sanderson before, and I was like getting a little bit more into fantasy. I only really started to read fantasy last year and started with like ACOTAR, Throne of Glass, etc. So very light fantasy, Fourth Wing. Now that those are under my belt, I kind of want to dive into some other fantasy narratives that are less fantasy romance focused. And I feel like Mistborn is a good place to start. And I really enjoyed this audiobook. The narration was good. While it was long, there was times where I wasn't as into it, and there was times where I was a bit more excited and a lot more things were happening. I thought the setting was really compelling with the mists, how the Ska were like scared to go out into the mists, and how everything was kind of dead. I feel like there was this red sky and there was ash falls, and people having to clean up the streets with ash falls, a bit like snow. There was different creatures in the mist, and at one point Vin is talking about how she finds out the leaves used to be green, and in her world, as far as she knows, leaves are all brown. And she thought about how ridiculous it was that like greenery and flowers ever existed, and I thought that was really interesting. It made for quite a interesting colour palette. I would like to see this kind of as a TV series or something like that, and seeing how they dressed the set. I think it made for a really cool backdrop for the story. I thought the characters were quite interesting, especially Vin and Calcier, but it was a little bit like there's this one young girl and then like all of these old men, which was interesting. And some of the other characters, they weren't as distinct, like I can't really remember them now, but they were interesting. I thought Sazed was interesting. I thought the boy that Vin meets at the balls, can't remember his name for the life of me, so sorry. He did leave an impression, but it's been like 3 months since I finished it, and now I can't remember his name, but I thought he was an interesting character. I liked, the relationship that developed between him and Vin. That was honestly one of the more interesting parts of the book for me, maybe because I'm a sucker for like the romantic tension. But I was also compelled by the overall plot, this idea of inciting a Ska rebellion. This was very similar themes to the book I'm writing, so when I read the synopsis that this is what book 1 was about, I was like, I probably should read that and check that it's distinct enough from what I'm doing. Because even the world, like this idea of the world being quite grey and quite dirty with the mists and everything. I don't have mists in mine, but it has similar aesthetics, so wanted to make sure that they were distinct enough, and so far they are, which is good. But I found it interesting to see the plan they come up with and how they decide to incite this rebellion. I thought the magic system was interesting as well, this idea of consuming metals, but it did get a little bit repetitive. It felt like it would make a really good video game because you have like Calcier explaining to Vin, who would be like your playable character, how it works and how you have to like turn on your copper and push your iron and pull your steel, or that maybe the other way around. And then that was repeated quite a lot of like she's pushing and pulling along from the different metals. It was very superhero, and I feel like that would be a really fun like video game to play with all of these different mechanics at play. These things were then like explained quite a lot, maybe more than is necessary, but as someone kind of new at fantasy, I think I appreciated like having it explained multiple times, especially since it was an audiobook, and like I said, my mind drifted, or I was like concentrating on driving at certain aspects, and then you miss things, and then when you miss things in fantasy you just kind of end up a little bit lost, which like is not a good situation. So even though it felt like a little bit much at times, it was probably actually very helpful. So overall, I enjoyed Mistborn. Took me a while to finish it, and I'm not sure if I'm going to read the next one because I feel like a lot was tied up quite nicely in the Final Empire. There are questions going forwards, and I do want to see how like relationships between different characters develop, how Vin develops going forwards. But like I'm not going to jump straight into it, and I'm also worried if I leave it too long to read The Well of Ascension that I will like forget a lot of it, and then I'll be even more lost. So I don't know. What do you think? Should I listen to Well of Ascension next? How long should I leave it? Let me know in the comments below. Next, I listened to another fantasy. I listened to A Darker Shade of Magic by V.E. Schwab, just book 1 again. Again, I thought the world building in this book was really interesting. I like this idea of parallel Londons, and I like that they all had a distinct aesthetic. The implied history explained during the novel of Black London, what happened to that, and how Red closed kind of a boundary between them and White London, leaving White London to kind of descend into chaos and like poverty. I thought that was interesting and had left for really distinct Londons. And I thought the plot was quite good at helping us to explore all of these different Londons, having this artifact that has to travel from grey to red to White London, and then having things happen in each of those different Londons. I thought it was a good plot mechanic to help us explore the world, which was the most interesting part of the story. However, I cannot for the life of me remember how this book ended, if they ended up, achieving their goal, if they ended up stuck in Black London or not. And that's not good. I guess I was maybe distracted when I listened to it, or maybe it's one of those books where I enjoyed the journey and then the ending just kind of like ended and I was like, cool, bye, close the chapter, move on to the next book, and like didn't leave as much of a lasting impression. Maybe it would have done if I'd physically read it rather than listened to it semi-distractedly, but I guess we'll never know. I thought the characters were interesting. I thought Kel, was, fairly interesting, but I can't recall like much complexity in his character. It's also like weird to go from Mistborn where Calcier is called like Cal a lot, and then he's called Kel. It was a lot of Cals and Kels in all of the audiobooks that I listened to for like 3 months. And I thought Calcier was a more compelling character than Kel ended up being. So I don't really have a lot to say about his character. I thought Lila was more interesting. I thought she was a really compelling character. I really got like what she wanted out of life and wanting adventure and escape. She was a little bit more hardened than Kel. She was a lot more, quick to kill and things like that, and that added a bit more depth. However, the narrator put on a real like Cockney voice for her, which I know she would have because she's come from like London and she's like working class in the normal mortal London. So it's an accent that makes sense for her, but it also like slightly annoyed me. It's not necessarily that it was the accent, but the portrayal, and because it was a man reading a woman as well with this Cockney voice. I don't think he delivered the lines the way I would have delivered them in my head reading it, and I thought the way I would have delivered it would have added more kind of depth to the interactions between her and Kel. I thought maybe I would have amped up maybe flirtation or romance slightly more than the performance that he gave. And so I think it affected how I experienced her as a character and her kind of conversations with Kel. And I think that's interesting. I think it shows that your reader, whether it's me or the audiobook reader or anyone else, will project what they want to project on to that character in that dialogue. It's interesting to think about how a story can be interpreted and experienced in like a million different ways, as many different ways as there are readers, and that when you have someone reading it to you in audiobook format, their kind of projected interpretation would like muddy your own, so it's not as organic as if you're reading it yourself. That's not to say like audiobooks don't count as reading or anything like that, because I think that's like, they're essential for making reading accessible to those that are visually impaired, but it does definitely still change the experience. So after Darker Shade of Magic, I didn't go on to the second book, still haven't. Let me know if I should read the second book of that as well. But like, I wasn't overly compelled to like find out what happens next. I enjoyed it, but like, that's about it. After this, I went on to listen to Frankie by Graham Norton, which is very different. And I wouldn't have normally read this book at all, but it was a book club pick for my work book club. And yeah, I wasn't like completely sold on reading it, which is why I didn't buy it and want to read it. So I was like, I'll just do it as an audiobook. That'll be easy. I can listen to it in the car, going to and from work, and like kind of get it done quickly. This was about an old woman and this like young man who's caring for her, and she kind of tells him her life story, in which she was like failed to kind of be the main character in her own story a lot of the time. She is Irish, obviously Graham Norton's Irish, so he wanted to bring his own experience to that. And she goes through life, she's kind of married off to someone who like quickly betrays her, and she ends up kind of shoved out of her home. She ends up getting in with like a lot of lesbians and getting shown the lesbian scene even though she's not a lesbian, and this creates some drama because this woman, this older lesbian, like kind of grooms her, wants to have a relationship with her, which she doesn't reciprocate, and you know that ends up with her being stranded in New York because she goes on this kind of work trip with her to New York. She, you know, accidentally offends her when she shuns her advances, and she basically ditches her in New York, and she has no passport or belongings or ways to get home because this woman basically like steals it all. So yeah, needless to say, Frankie has like a bit of a tough time where she's screwed over by men and women, but it ends up landing her in New York, kind of free, single, and like free to like make whatever life she wants for herself. This results in her falling in love and getting married to this man who's a bit of a struggling artist type. She works in a restaurant which she ends up taking over when the woman who owns it leaves it in her will for her, and Frankie encourages her husband in his art and kind of helps him like eventually become a really famous artist. And we kind of follow their relationship as they go through like the turbulence of him being a struggling artist and then him taking off and becoming famous and how that changes things. And you know, we're seeing Frankie at the end of her life and seeing how things ended up for her, and you know, you have to feel a bit sorry for Frankie, but she still had a full life. She had love, she had a lot of friendships, and like, you know, things just do come to a natural end even when, you know, you have a lot of good times. One thing this book did really well was it covered a lot of the AIDS pandemic in the 90s. During this time in New York, Frankie becomes friends with a lot of gay men, and then she is kind of experiencing this pandemic as their friend, losing people, and this ends up being a really tragic time in her life as she faces a lot of losses. So this book did have some tragedy and it was emotional. It was made a little bit more poignant by the fact that the caterer who's taking care of the older Frankie who's telling these stories is gay himself, so he's learning a bit about a time in history that he didn't experience as a younger person. And the book's a little sad because like a lot of things didn't really work out well for Frankie, but she's still kind of happily reminiscing in her old age, which shows quite a nice attitude. I'm glad I read it because it's not the kind of book I would normally read, but I'm not sure if I would like reread it or necessarily recommend it. I think it was just kind of like a nice story with like ups and downs, all of the ups and downs of life. And the final book that I listened to this year so far is 19 Minutes by Jodi Picoult. And this is probably my favourite of the fiction books that I've listened to this year so far. I read this because me and my housemate watched Adolescence, which obviously was very popular this year, and that kind of explored the why of, you know, how a violent act might happen, and this book explores that as well. She'd read it before and she was like, oh, you have to read it, it kind of covers these themes very well. 19 Minutes is about a school shooting that occurs within 19 minutes, and it starts off by kind of saying, you know, in 19 minutes you could mow the lawn, you could, you know, put on some laundry, or you could take revenge. There's a lot you could do, and you know, this is the choice that this person made. Similar to Adolescence, it covers a lot of different characters and you kind of see the impact of this crime, not just on the victims and not just on the perpetrator, but on everyone around them, the police, the lawyers working on the case, the parents of the perpetrator himself, some of the near victims who didn't lose their lives but were close to, or who knew people that lost their lives in the shooting. The timeline that we follow in the book is really interesting because we follow a little bit up to the events of the shooting, and then we follow kind of the week, the day after, the week after, the month after, 3 months after. But in between these sections, we also flip back in time, so we see like 10 years before, like 5 years before, 1 year before, 6 months before. So you see Peter, who's a shooter, you know, grew up from a young age with his friend Josie, who we have a point of view from as well. We see like how he was bullied at school, how he was told he needed to stand up for himself, but how that never really worked and the bullying was really severe. We see the awful behaviour of these bullies who, you know, we know from the start of the book have lost their lives because he shot them. And we see not just like Matt's behaviour towards Peter. Matt is one of the main kind of characters that are killed, but his behaviour towards Josie, his girlfriend, and how it's like pretty abusive. You can see coercion just from chapter 1, which is, you know, the day of the shooting. And, you know, you're not that sad that he's died, because he is kind of a piece of shit, and that only kind of becomes more apparent as you go through the book, and he does more and more bad things in the run up to the shooting. But even though that is the case, like, he still doesn't deserve to die, so it adds quite a lot of nuance. We also see a lot of good in Peter, the shooter. You know, like I said, he was like horrendously bullied, but we see, you know, that he has feelings for Josie that aren't quite reciprocated. We see the pain of that. We see his father like taking him hunting and like teaching him how to use guns, but from probably like a bit too young of an age. We see Peter like interpreting that and not really grasping it the way his father is intending. So even though, you know, what his father's doing by the American standards, maybe not the British standards, it's not wrong. Like, he's teaching him gun safety, but like Peter's too young to think about this. Not that like bad gun safety is then the cause of the tragedy, because the tragedy is very intentional. It's an intentional shooting, but we see how Peter views guns as like a cool thing, as maybe a solution early on, and just how this all layers to make him into the person capable of doing this act. So you feel a lot of like sympathy for Peter or empathy for his situation, but you're still never kind of justifying his actions, because like no matter how much he was in the right and Matt was in the wrong, and the other people who were shot, oh, some of them, you know, were just innocent victims who hadn't ever done anything. But you know, it never justifies what he ends up doing, but it does add a lot of nuance. We see so much nuance in the other characters. We see Lacey, who is Peter's mum, and she's like a lovely person. She's a midwife. She's bringing new life into the world all the time, and we see her reflecting on like where she might have gone wrong in parenting, how she could have gone so wrong, and I feel a lot of sympathy for her as well, because while you can see some mistakes that she makes, it's like you would never expect those mistakes to snowball into your son becoming a shooter. Like, it doesn't really feel fair to blame her, even though she does carry a little bit of blame. But there are definitely like a lot of people who are worse parents than that don't have that outcome. So it's hard to just pin all your blame on her and her husband. We also see a lot of layers with Josie, who passes out during the shooting, and she isn't killed by Peter. And you know, her boyfriend's been killed, and she's grieving him even though he was abusive. She never recognizes it as abuse even until the end of the novel release. So that adds a lot of layers where you as the reader are like, this is really toxic what Matt is doing to her, and it's frustrating that she can't see that. She was friends with Peter, but kind of distances herself from him because she's trying to be popular and doesn't always speak up when he's bullied, like in the later years. And so that adds a lot of nuance to things. Her mother is a lawyer, and she's a judge, and she at first sits as a judge on the case. She does eventually like have a lot of conflict about stepping down, because Josie's obviously like involved in the case, even though she wasn't necessarily a victim. So that adds a lot of layers, and her mother you know, has to grapple with like whether she should be on the case or not. She feels driven to be on it because she feels like she can do proper justice, but then it's, you know, costing her stuff with her relationship with her daughter. And also she knew Peter as a kid as well, so you know, it adds a lot of complexity. And there's other characters as well, which I won't get into, but all of this to say is it's a very complex and layered narrative that really builds up to a picture. And even though the shooting happens very early on, and you know that Peter is guilty, and that, you know, 10 people have been killed and other people have been injured, and like he's pretty much, definitely going to go to jail. He's not going to be acquitted at all, even though he does have a lawyer that's going to try to get him acquitted. There are still mysteries to be learned, and there's still twists right up until the last page, where you're piecing together all of the whys and like what exactly happened. And it was just expertly done. It was really well written. I didn't lose any attention at all. I paid attention to all of it, even when I was a little distracted. I paid attention to it all, even though I had the same distractions present than when I listened to Mistborn and the other books. But because it was such an extreme topic, you pretty much like have to pay attention to it because it's just so thoroughly compelling. And so hands down, that's been my favourite listen of the year so far. And I've already downloaded some more Jodie Picoult books to listen to because she always seems to tackle really controversial topics that she does a lot of research on in her books. So I want to dive a little bit more into the Jodie Picoult catalogue. Let me know if you've read or listened to any of these books and what you thought of them. What audiobooks have you listened to recently? Is there any ones that you would recommend with good narrators? I will be back with another video next week, and I'll be back with another audiobook roundup at the end of the year, probably December. Currently, I'm listening to Butter, so I'll talk about that in my next one, only on chapter 2. So far, I'm enjoying it. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye!